Okay, so I'm going to do a video about how to solve ABG problems, arterial blood gases, and some practice questions. So up here, I have the normal ranges for pH, 7.35 to 7.45. The normal range for CO2 is 35 to 45, which, if you notice, is the same as the pH, 35 to 45. So that's easy to remember, and that's nice. And then lastly, HCO3, which is the bicarb, and the normal range for that is 22 to 26. And I'm going to leave this up here for reference throughout the entire video, so we can come back to it and reference it. So first, when you solve ABGs, the first thing you're going to do is like, let me actually go ahead and put up a practice question or a practice like ABG result. So let's say our results look like this. Our pH is 7.3. Our CO2 is 53. And our bicarb, or HCO3, is 25. When we're solving an ABG problem, the first thing we want to do is first evaluate the pH. Okay, so the pH is 7.3. Is that high or low? Well, let's look at the norm. Normal is 7.35 to 7.45. So this is only 7.3, which means that our pH is low. And on the pH scale, if it's below 7.35, it's going to be acidic. If it's above 7.45, it's going to be basic or alkalotic or alkaline. So I guess I can put that over here, but over this way is acidic, right? And over this way is basic, alkalotic, whichever one helps you remember better. Back this up a little bit so you can see. Okay, now the other thing I didn't mention in the beginning was that CO2 is our primary source of acid. I don't know if you can read that or not. And HCO3, the bicarb, is our primary source of base or alkaline. So I'm going to put base here. So in this practice example, we notice that our pH is low, which means that it's acidic, right? Now, the CO2 is really high, it's 53. The normal is 35 to 45. So that means that the CO2 is up. And if carbon dioxide or CO2 is acidic and it's elevated, that means we have an excess of acid in the body. So here's more acid contributing to the problem that we have an acidic pH. And now here we have the bicarb, or HCO3, which is 25. And that's within normal range, right? So that's good, check mark. Now, what do? How do you solve this? How do you label this? Well, first, like I said, you look at the pH. pH is acidic. Look at the next one here. This is acidic. And now we have to determine if it's fully compensated, partially compensated, all that jazz. So we notice that the only one that out of whack is the carbon dioxide, right? The bicarb is good, right? So we know that the CO2 is the originator of the problem, so to speak. There's too much carbon dioxide in the body, which is creating a super acidic environment, which is making the pH drop. So the guilty party, so to speak, is the CO2, which comes from the respiratory system, because you breathe in oxygen, and you exhale carbon dioxide. So we know that it's going to be a respiratory cause. So I'm going to put respiratory there as the issue, because the pH is acidic and an excess of CO2 makes it more acidic. So we know it's going to be acidosis, respiratory acidosis. Now what we have to decide now, is it acute? Is it compensated? Is it partially compensated? Now, one of the tricks of the trade, so to speak, is you can also, I'll tell you exactly how to do it, but there's also another trick to do it. You can look and see if there's only one that has the problem, right? Only the carbon dioxide or the respiratory system has the problem. The bicarb is normal, so this one's within normal range. If only one of them is messed up, it's going to be acute. And the reason being is that it's just a sudden onset, it's just started. Perhaps this patient, whoever has this ABG, maybe they're just not exhaling enough. Maybe they have COPD or something, and they just have a buildup of carbon dioxide inside of them, and it's just rising, and so it's causing their pH to go down. Now, eventually, hopefully, in a normal person, the body will start trying to compensate to make up for the fact that there's a buildup of CO2 happening. So eventually, when the body starts trying to fix itself, then the metabolic system, the one responsible for the bicarb, will start to kick in and start activating. So what will happen is the bicarb will be like, hey, so our body is super acidic right now. I should try to like make more bicarb because we're super basic, right? To try and balance it out. So you'll start seeing this number start to creep up higher. So, right now it's 25, but as it starts to compensate to kind of like balance out all the acid, it'll start to go up. So maybe it'll start to be like 28, and you get even higher, like 30, 35, or whatever. So when it starts doing that, when the second system starts getting out of range to try and compensate, now we get into like a situation where it's fully compensated or partially compensated. Now, it only becomes fully compensated when the other system like adjusts so much that the pH goes back to normal. And we'll see that in another example, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So again, this one, acute respiratory acidosis. I'll go ahead and erase this one and move on to the next one. Okay, our next question, our next practice problem, the pH is going to be 7.34. The carbon dioxide, CO2, is going to be 26. And the bicarb, HCO3, is going to be 18. Okay, so the first step was we evaluate the pH. 7.34. Well, the normal is 7.35 to 7.45. So it's low, right? The pH is low, which means it's acidic. So we'll put that up here next to it. Acidic. Next, we look at the carbon dioxide, and we notice that, oh, look, the carbon dioxide is low as well. It should be between 35 and 45, but it's not. It's 26. So the carbon dioxide is low. Now, if carbon dioxide is a source of acid, right, but it's super low, that means that it's not producing as much acid as it should be. So that would create a more basic environment. If it's not producing the amount of acid that it should, it's producing less, that would shift it more towards the basic side. So we see this is base. So now we see that the respiratory system or the carbon dioxide isn't the source of the problem, right? Because when they match, that's when we see that it's the source of the problem. Like in the previous problem, we saw that the carbon dioxide was super high and the pH was really acidic. So we know, oh, okay, the carbon dioxide is causing the problem. Now this one, we see that just the opposite is happening. The pH is low, which is acidic, but the carbon dioxide is super low, which means it's creating a basic environment. So like, okay, so now we look at the bicarb. The bicarb is 18. Now we know that the bicarb is supposed to be between 22 and 26, which means that the bicarb is low. And if it's not producing as much base as it should be, that's going to cause the scale to tip over to an acidic environment. So this is low, which means that it's not producing enough, which makes it, makes it a more acidic environment because it's not producing the base that it should. So what does this mean? Well, we look and see the pH is acidic, right? Now, which one of these two is also acidic? It's the bicarb. So we know that the problem, or the guilty party, so to speak, is originating from the metabolic system, the part that's creating the bicarb, or in this case, not producing enough. So we know that it is a metabolic issue. If the metabolic was producing as much base as it should be, we wouldn't be having this problem. And we know that it's acidosis because that's what the pH is telling us. The pH tells us it's acidic. So it's acidosis. And now we have to decide, okay, is it compensated, fully compensated, partially compensated? Now, this is what I was talking about in the last problem, where the metabolic system is the originator of the issue, right? For whatever reason, the metabolic system is not producing as much HCO3 or bicarb as it should be. It should be producing between 22 and 26, and it's not. So that means it's falling into the acidic range. So the carbon dioxide starts to compensate to make up for it, right? So it starts decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide in order to try and like compensate for it to balance it out. So we see that the carbon dioxide system, even though they aren't the ones responsible for the issue, they're trying to compensate by lowering itself to create more base to try and counterbalance the acidity. So we know that it's, there's some compensation happening, but it's only partially compensated because the pH is still abnormal, right? It will be fully compensated when the pH goes back to normal levels. So this would be partially compensated metabolic acidosis. Now, if we had these same exact numbers and the pH was 7.36, which is within normal range, then you could say it's fully compensated metabolic acidosis, which means that the respiratory system has really come in clutch and really done its job to get that pH back within normal range. All right, so let's go ahead and erase this one. Do some more. Next one, we'll have the pH be 7.48. The CO2 will be 40. And the bicarb, HCO3, bicarb is just a lot easier to say than HCO3, is going to be 28. Make sure we all still see that. Let's move it over here a little bit, make room for myself. Okay. So, okay, what do we do first? First, let's look at the pH. Is it in range? Is it between 7.35 and 7.45? No, it is not. It is 7.48, which means it is high, which means it is what? Basic. And you can also, again, say alkaline or alkalotic. That's just a lot harder to say, and it's too many A's, acidic, alkaline, alkalotic. So I just have basic, it's easier to say. So it's basic. Carbon dioxide is 40. So is that within normal range? Oh, yes, it is. It is good. And then bicarb is 28, which is out of range. So it's high. We have too much bicarb happening, and remember bicarb is basic. So if it's too much of base, that's contributing to why the pH is basic, right? The metabolic system is just producing all the bicarb, and it's just like, okay, well, that's too much. Thanks. Now we're basic. So these two things match, right? This matches this. So we know that the metabolic system is the cause of the problem. That's where the problem has originated. So we know it's a metabolic, and it's alkalosis. So now you get to see that word, alkalosis. There we are. Now we have to decide, okay, acute, compensated, fully compensated. Remember I said in the very beginning that when you only have one that's out of whack, one system, whether it be this one or this one, doesn't matter, it's going to be acute, right? And the reason being is because we can see that the bicarb is out of whack, but the respiratory system hasn't yet kicked in to try and counteract what the metabolic system is doing. So it's acute. It's probably because it just started. The body hasn't had a chance to kick in and try and fix things yet. So it's acute metabolic acidosis. All right. You guys are doing so good. I'm going to try and give an example of many different possible outcomes because you can have a lot. So the next one will have a pH of 7.47, a CO2 of 52, and a bicarb of 30. Okay, so let's analyze this one. pH 7.47, that's really high, which means that it's basic. Okay, CO2 is 52, that's out of range, producing too much, we don't want that much. Now when you have too much CO2, that's more acid, so this is creating acid. This does not match this, right? Acid and base are opposite, so we know that the CO2, extra CO2 isn't going to make the body basic, right? So the problem is probably here. So the bicarb level is 30, which is out of range, and it's high. So too much bicarb or too much source of base is going to make it basic. So we can see that this matches this, which means that the metabolic system is the cause of the problem. That's the guilty party. So it's a metabolic, and it's alkalosis. I'm like lunging across the camera, sorry. And okay, is it acute? Is it fully compensated? Is it partially compensated? Well, let's look at it. We can see here that the problem originated with the metabolic system, right? Made the pH basic. Now the respiratory system's like, hey, okay, let's also compensate and try to fix it and try to help. So I'm gonna increase my acidity level to try and fix the pH, but the pH is still out of norm, right? So it's not fully compensated yet, it's only partially. So we're gonna do partially PC, partially compensated metabolic acidosis. Now again, eventually, hopefully, as the body continues to compensate, this will maybe continue to go up, maybe 54, 55, and then this one will start to come down, eventually to 7.45. And then even though these are still out of range, this will be in range, and then it will be fully compensated. So, all right, let's erase this one and move on to the next one. I think this next one here is a case of a fully compensated, so you can kind of see what that looks like. All right, let's look at this. The pH of 7.44, CO2 of 54, and bicarb, HCO3 of 28. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, if you just were to look at the top one, 7.44, you'd be like, oh, cool, sweet. pH is good, so moving on. It's like, well, hold on, don't get carried away. The pH is normal, but the rest of it may not. So the CO2 is 54, normal is 40, up to 45. So this is too high. So this is not normal, right? This is creating a source of acidity because too much of an acid makes it more acidic. So this is acidic. And now the bicarb, we can see, is also high. Normal is up to 26, it is 28. So this is high, which means that they're trying to produce, they're producing more base, right? So, okay, you're like, well, now what, right? This is acid, this is base, but this is normal, so I don't really know what to do. Well, straight off the bat, we can just write down that it's fully compensated, right? Because these two are not, these are out of whack, but this is correct. So we can just start with saying it's fully compensated, because we can see that the body has adjusted itself enough to get the pH within normal range. Now, kind of what happens here is you look at the pH and be like, okay, 7.44 is on the upper end of normal, right? Like just if it were just, you know, 7.46, it would be out of range, right? So this is more on the alkalotic or basic side, right? So we're going to call it alkalosis, right? I'm just going to put alk, just know that's for alkalosis. And then, okay, is it coming from the CO2 or is it coming from the bicarb? Well, remember, if we're calling this alkalosis, you just go with whichever one matches. So if this is alkalosis or basic, which one of these is causing that problem? Ah, well, the bicarb is basic or increased, increased base levels. So that's contributing to why this is probably high. So that's where we're going to go with metabolic acidosis, or sorry, alkalosis, not acidosis. And this is because, like I said, the originator of the problem started probably with the metabolic system producing too much base. And then the respiratory system jumped on board to try and fix it. And we see that this got really high, right? So this got high enough to bring this pH back into normal range. But this was ultimately what caused the problem, because we can see this is basic, too much base, and it's just, it's almost on the too high basic level. So basically, you're just going to look at the pH when it's fully compensated and be like, okay, if you were to split 7.35 and 7.45, like down the middle, right? Basically, if it's closer to this half, it's alkalotic, and if it's closer to this half, it's acidosis. So that's how you figure out which one of these guys is causing the problem when you have a fully compensated situation. Erase this. Hopefully that made sense. I think we have another one, so we can go ahead and look at another example of fully compensated. I feel like those are probably the most difficult because everything is, kind of crazy. Okay, so the next one is, let's look at a pH of 7.37, a CO2 level of 53, and a bicarb HCO3 level of 31. Okay, so first thing we do is we look at the pH. Well, the pH looks like it's normal, right? It's 7.37, which is in range. So give it a check mark because it's good. Next is the carbon dioxide, and we notice, okay, well, carbon dioxide is high, right? So we get an up arrow. And when there's too much carbon dioxide, it makes it more acidic, right? So we're going to put acid next to that. And then we look at the bicarb, the HCO3 level, and that is 31, which is also high, which makes it more basic. Now, right off the bat, we can go ahead and say, okay, these are out of whack and these are abnormal, but the pH is good. So we know that we're fully compensated. So let's just start there. Fully compensated, right? And then we have to decide, is it metabolic? Is it respiratory? Is it acidosis? Is it alkalosis? Well, let's first start with the pH. We see that it's 7.37, which is really, really close to the lower side, right? So it's much closer to the acidic level than it is to the alkalotic or basic level. If you cut the 7.35 and 7.45 down the middle, this would definitely fall to the acidic side. So we're going to call this acidic over here, right? And which one matches it, right? This one matches it. So we know it's starting, the originator of the problem came from the lungs, the respiratory system. So we're going to call this fully compensated respiratory acidosis. Hopefully this is making sense, it's becoming easier, more clear. I think we'll go ahead and stop there as far as practice problems. Actually, I think I'll just put up a few sample problems and then give you a chance to work them out on your own. And then I will put the answers like in the comments under the caption of the video, and you can see if you get them right. So this way I'm not going to work them through and tell you the answers, but give you a chance to practice it. So let's do that. Let's do number one. We'll have pH of 7.48, CO2 of 29, and a bicarb of 17. Get that in there. Wow, that's really squeaky. Okay, practice problem number 2. We'll do pH of 7.10, a CO2 of 69, and a bicarb of 28. See that? Okay, and then we'll do another one over here. Do number 3. Let's do pH of 7.36, CO2 of 27, and a bicarb of 18. And then for the last practice question, and again, I will post the answers. Practice them on your own, see if you get them right. pH 7.32, CO2 49, and a bicarb of 25. So I'll go ahead and leave that up for a second. Go ahead and try and practice them on your own. Maybe push pause on the video and see if you can't get the right answers. Hope this video is helpful to you, and best of luck solving all your ABG problems.